Very good. Thank you for the kind introductions, and we appreciate this opportunity. Miriam and I have been partners in many webinars over the years, and this is one of our favorite topics. The topic for today is curriculum mapping, and this is something that our company has done with companies around the world, helping them kind of see the big picture. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to a company called Ashcom. Ashcom is a sort of a mixture of a whole bunch of different companies that we work with. So
it's fictitious.
It's fictitious, but it is also very real. The company itself is a manufacturing company based in the United States. It employs 7,000 people. And it has some significant challenges. So before we go too far, we will introduce some of the leaders at Ashcom and show you a bit of their bio. So the very first one is the Chief Learning Officer. Her name is Catherine. Catherine came from 3M, a company that many of you know, and became the CLO at Ashcom about 4 years before our story begins. She understood the learning science, certainly, but her primary role at Ashcom is to direct and oversee learning. She's a systems thinker. Some of you are also systems thinkers. And so that's really her focus. That's the role that she plays. Also part of the Ashcom learning team is someone named Maggie. Maggie is a senior instructional design. She has been with Ashcom the longest, for nearly 20 years. She started out in human resources and then later on did a master's degree in instructional design. And her role is senior instructional designer. The next person we have is Alicia. Alicia is young, a recent graduate of an instructional design program. I like how she moves. And so not terribly experienced, but she makes up for with enthusiasm. She is their go-to techie guru who has really kept them apace with some of the latest learning and technology trends in L&D. Next up is Michael. Michael serves as an advisor to Catherine, to the CLO. He's a former college professor with experience in higher ed administration. And Michael is helpful to Catherine and the learning team in building strategy. He's a wealth of knowledge. And then finally, Amy. Amy is also not technically an employee of Ashcom, but she's a trusted member of the team. She's a consultant to Ashcom. One of the benefits of Amy is that she works with a bunch of different clients. So she can always benchmark what one client is doing over against another. And so she's been incredibly helpful to the Ashcom team. So Miriam, what did I miss?
Oh, nothing. What I was going to say is that part of the reason we have a whole companion series of ebooks with these characters. And the reason that we wanted to introduce characters, and Jerry wrote all this, is that we hope our listeners, one of these characters are going to resonate with you. And this doesn't feel just like sort of a bland case study, although we do have some case studies at the end of this presentation.
We have bland case studies?
No, they're not bland. They're exciting.
Okay, good.
But that you would be able to sort of resonate with both the character and then the problem that Jerry's going to describe. And then once we hear that, we will dive into some real specifics about how they work through curriculum mapping. But I think this makes a more personal approach and hopefully more interesting for you.
Yeah, I agree. So we have written our ebooks primarily as narratives, as stories. So we always take on a problem like judging ROI or XR, AR, VR, or and in this case, the problem that they're attempting to solve is around curriculum mapping. So this is the problem. This is what happens to the learning team at Ashcom. Ashcom is sort of chugging along nicely. They're slowly converting some of their more classroom learning experiences into digital learning experiences. They're setting a pace of about 5 to 10% transition per year. And then something extraordinary happens and sort of explodes all of their plans. And it is not COVID.
Right.
Although I'm sure that has happened to many of you that had wonderful, wonderful plans prior to 2020. What happens to Catherine and Ashcom is that Ashcom acquires another manufacturing company just like them that works in the same space. So they kind of acquire a competitor of theirs. And now the learning team is tasked with figuring out how to proceed. So you can imagine you have your own processes. The company that you've acquired has its own processes. There is a lot of duplication. There are some significant gaps. And there's just flat out differences. So Ashcom does things one way. The company that they acquire is called Globex. And Globex has very different processes. So they have to, they have all of this training. So they have to train the Globex people, the acquisition people, to think like Ashcom people. But they're also realizing some of the Ashcom learning experiences are kind of dated and old too and need to be revamped. And so when Catherine learns what's going to happen, she calls her team together and begins to think through this. How do they address all of this? And what they come to is what we call curriculum mapping. I'm hoping that that is a familiar term to many of you. Maybe it isn't, but Miriam, talk a little bit about sort of a 50,000 foot view of what we mean when we say curriculum mapping.
Sure. Curriculum mapping, you may refer to it as program mapping, but the concept here is that it's really creating a scope and sequence of content for any larger program. So obviously in the situation they're in, we're not talking about designing a few modules or something like that. We have two companies coming together who both probably have leadership training, safety training, onboarding. Some of it might be online, some of it isn't. Of course, they all take their own approach. And what we need to do and what they needed to do was sit down and essentially create, it ends up working into like a spreadsheet, a large map that maps everything we do have, what's redundant, where the gaps are, and then it really creates a plan. It points you to what should your first priorities be to start creating a cohesive program. And we'll dig into the details of that, but at a large level, that's what it is.
Yeah, and that's tricky. That could, in Ashcom's case, it comes because of a merger. For many of us, it came because of COVID, making the transition from traditional learning to digital learning. But it can come from other things too, where suddenly there's a new product or a new process, or you take on a new client or something like that, and you have to get alignment. And really, that's sort of what this is. So let's dive into some of the key elements. The very first one, and I like the fact that Miriam, it's described this way: visual alignment. It's not just alignment; it's actual alignment you can see.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so we've used a variety of tools, whether it's a spreadsheet or some, mapping tool kind of a thing. But the idea is that we have to be able to see where there's overlap, and so we might color code programs that are similar, concepts that where there's a gap. But I'm able to, at a quick glance, look at a screen and see what programs I have that all line up. Where the holes are, where we have redundancy, and we might need to remove something. And in a second, we'll go to like each, we're actually going to talk through a curriculum map, but
yeah, I think we have 3 examples at the end. Right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. But it creates some order and structure. And what really helps, and I will say this in our experience working with our clients, especially because of COVID, or in a situation like Ashcom, when they come to meet with us, there is a lot of tension. I mean, people are stressed. They have to do these things quickly. It feels just like this massive chaos. And for us to be able to say, no, we can help you through this. There's a process, there's an order. And when you're done, you're going to know exactly what your priorities are. You can visibly see like the pressure go down in the room.
I think Catherine or one of her team members in the ebook described it as it's like somebody walked into a library and just threw all the books on the floor.
Exactly.
And all of the order and numeric system to put them in order and topic and everything else by author and all of that got sort of thrown on the floor. And are there books in there? Yes, there are.
Right.
Are they the same books that were in there before? Yes, they are. They're there, but it is chaotic and unstructured, and in the middle of chaos and lack of structure, people tend to make some significant mistakes.
For sure. Yeah.
Not just in even in getting the right set of priorities or making knowing the difference between something that's important and something that's urgent.
Yes.
So making sure that you are working on things that are both important and urgent. There's a way to work on things that are urgent and not important.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way to work on things that are important but not urgent. What you really want to do is get that order and structure.
Yep.
And this is not short-term thinking.
No.
You're really not planning for the next 6 weeks or even probably 6 months. It's often measured in sometimes even in years, where you truly have a map that will lead you to that. And then that big picture kind of that we've talked about, being able to see that and knowing where you are in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of akin to driving, right? Or using a map. You can see where you are in the journey. Talk about creating alignment and stakeholders, because often in learning, there's all sorts of people with all sorts of agendas.
Right. And that's one of the biggest, I'd say, like the big value from a curriculum map is you'll pull together your stakeholders, you're going to get alignment. But what's more important, I think, is not maybe in that moment, in those 2 or 3 days that you're doing all this planning. It's 6 months down the road, there's a big crisis or a big problem or a big opportunity. And we know in the L&D department, everything needed to be done yesterday. Mm-hmm. And so someone comes to you and there's a huge problem and you need to put out this fire now. And what you do then is you can pull out your curriculum map. You can see where that fire fits. And to be fair, sometimes we have to scrap everything and put out the fire.
Because things change.
Right, exactly. But it also allows us to say, actually, hey, we have this big picture plan. And in 3 months, we're starting to tackle that. It also helps you with your stakeholders and your subject matter experts, because obviously they know their subject so well, but in their mind, everything is so important. Yeah. And it allows you to step back and say, well, we also have these 4 other stakeholders, and what you're talking about doesn't really fit right now, or it fits later, but it creates, I think, a set of standards and benchmarks that you judge everything against.
And sometimes in webinars, we've had lengthier conversations about this, but we make jokes about the secret stakeholder.
Yes.
We've all done work like that where everybody's in agreement and you produce what you agree to produce. And suddenly some stakeholder comes flying out of somewhere that no one knew about, maybe one person knew about, and they disrupt the whole thing.
Yep.
If you can get those stakeholders aligned, not just on the learning team, but in it could be in operations, it could be in finance, somewhere in the C-suite, that everybody is aligned and agrees to the map. Now you've got sort of the rules.
Right, exactly. It's a great way to put it.
Same thing with designing goals and objectives. Those of you who are in L&D, you may find, you probably have found in certain instances, that one of the more difficult things is designing the goals and actually creating the objectives and getting people to agree on them.
Yep.
Sometimes it's very much, we just need to do this. We just need to make this thing.
Right.
There's this thing we need to address. There's this situation we need to fix, and we just need to do it. And we haven't laid out the objectives for that at all. You have done this needs analysis, needs assessment, curriculum mapping numerous times, Miriam, and I'm guessing you will tell us, I know you will tell us because you've told me before, that sometimes getting that agreement on clear objectives and goals is one of the toughest things to do.
Well, and our listeners will see in the case studies later, it's critical. And we often talk about slowing down first to speed up later.
Well, that's one of my favorite Miriam expressions. We need to slow down so we can go faster, so we can speed up.
Right. And you'll see, you know, in our last 3 case studies that had things just sort of plowed ahead. Those companies actually would have missed huge amounts of content or had tons of overlap and really wasted a lot of money. So yeah, that will become more apparent as we start going through.
And sometimes those projects come back to us. Sometimes people start a project, they get into it, they realize their goals are unclear, their objectives are unclear, and then you have to really go back to the beginning.
Yes.
And start all over.
Right.
And it's wasteful, it's not lean, and it's a lot of time and a lot of energy, and there's an emotional toll.
Yes.
There's a lot of frustration as those things happen. So, well, let's talk through just sort of the steps. This is a bit of an image of the steps of curriculum mapping. And Miriam, can you sort of walk us through the left side and the top and talk about what these things are?
Yeah, absolutely. And then what we'll do in the subsequent slides is sort of do a deep dive into each of the columns you see across the top. But these are the things that we have found most helpful when we gather a group of people together to do curriculum mapping. So I will also say this, that a curriculum mapping session is typically 2 or 3 sessions, and they're a couple hours each. If you try to grab your team for an entire day, you will have mutiny about 3 hours in, because it's such high level thinking to think through these things. Often there's a lot of consensus building.
Smaller chunks of time spread out over more days, so people have time to think, process. There's some consensus building, and like you said, there's emotions attached to some of this. So, but at a high level, we're going to look at the organizational goals and then the specific business outcomes. We're going to define who the stakeholders are, what the organizational values are, and I'll just define how that's different than the goals, what the learning culture looks like, who my learners are. And then at the end, we start to get into, I would say in a typical curriculum mapping, we never actually write an objective, but we definitely organize and define the topics and where they all fit. And then as a part of the conversation in each one of those, we're looking at what's the priority. So for example, if my organization has a goal that it has to be met this year and I'm being measured on that KPI, like that is a huge priority. And there's a huge risk if it's delayed. And there's a benefit if I can get it done even sooner. So we kind of discuss those, and kind of woven throughout all of this is always what priority is this topic and what are my risks or benefits depending on what speed I move to get this done. Okay. So let's dive into this. The very first one that we look at is organizational goals. Not always easily uncovered because not everyone always agrees on an organization's goals. Even people within the organization might not agree. Various departments in a company or an organization might have different views of what the organization is actually trying to accomplish. And so talk us through this.
Well, one of the first questions we ask, and it seems super obvious, but we say, what are your organizational goals for this year and what have they been for past years? And that sounds really obvious. But
it should take 2 minutes to say that.
Right. But you have to understand, again, remember, and those of you that are on L&D teams, you get it. You have a meeting with someone who has a problem or a crisis. The first question is, okay, here are my topics. I need you to create a learning module for this. Go. And so when you say, well, wait a second, this is a huge program, I think we should step back and what are our goals for the year? Again, you may face some resistance. Like, what are you doing? We needed this done yesterday.
Right.
But if I don't understand what my goal is for this year and next year, I might be rushing off creating something that isn't aligned at all. It might be really important to that department, but it's not aligned at all to the rest of the organization's priorities. And like you said, there's often new or hidden priorities that we uncover. And at this stage, it might not take long. Hopefully it takes 10 minutes.
In well-organized companies and where there's great communication and there's clarity, right? If you have communication and clarity, chances are the vast majority of people understand the organization's goals. In situations where you do not have clarity and you do not have communication, you can walk into a situation of 50 people where there's 30 different organizational priorities and goals.
Yes.
And they are diametrically opposed to one another sometimes.
Yes. And often one thing that we find, and I suspect this will resonate with our listeners, but often the L&D team will work a little bit in isolation. I mean, they're aware, but sometimes they're not invited to the table at the C-suite, which can be frustrating. And so sometimes it's also for their information. Like they need to know a little bit more about what the priorities are for the year and how to balance that with what they're being asked.
I read an interesting study in the last week or two about, and again, it has to do with COVID, but since COVID, so much emphasis has been placed on digital learning, and so much emphasis has been placed on learning and training and development in general, that suddenly the chief learning officer position is invited to a lot more meetings
which is great.
And part of that is because the budgets are going up too. You sent me an article, I think, that showed budgets are increasing in learning, in organizations. Their learning budget is increasing what? About
50%.
50% a year. Because people are, and plus, people are quitting their jobs, changing jobs quickly. Employee retention. You have onboarding. Some of the organizations we deal with have over 100% turnover.
Yeah, it's really crazy.
When people first hear that, you say, well, how can there be 100%? Right. Because some positions are turned over 4 times inside one. You've had 4 different people in the same job inside of 12 months. And all you're doing is onboarding. So,
and the cost is huge.
And the cost to attract them to apply. And then you have the lag time where they're not producing and you're training them to produce. Yeah, so I think the learning team is inside organizations are getting a lot more love than they used to get,
and a lot more scrutiny.
Yes, they are. They are a lot more scrutiny.
Yeah.
So after we've looked at organizational goals, then we spend some time looking at business outcomes, and this is interesting because I would look at this and say, well, the organizational goal is to be profitable.
Right.
And all of a sudden you're talking business outcomes. Aren't these the same thing?
Right.
They're really not.
Right. And that is something actually, so I talked with a couple of people on our team that do curriculum mapping quite a bit and said, help me understand how we can help our listeners grasp these are 2 different things. So we can have organizational goals. And those are great. And we hope we're all pulling towards those. But often you'll find when you sit down at the table is the goals are one thing, but then somebody says, those are great, but here's the thing. This is what I'm being measured on. This is my KPI for the year. And so
these are quantitative, numeric goals.
Exactly. So what we like to ask is, what are you currently being held against? Because that really informs when we're putting together a plan of topics and how we're going to roll out this big learning program. We need to have that top of mind. I'm being measured against this. How are we going to design a learning program that helps us improve what we're being measured against?
Right.
And another great question is, what should we be measuring or tracking that maybe we don't know? Like a lot of times those people that those stakeholders, they'll say, well, we really should also be measuring this. And then our response is, how can we help you? Like, let's design some sort of learning experience that helps improve that as well. It's really almost performance consulting at this point, but that's how it's very different than an organizational goal. It's very measurable.
And you're not yet into the learning conversation.
Right.
But you're pointing people, once we get organizational goals clear and we get business outcomes clear, then we can talk about whatever learning asset that we want to build or learning experience that we want to build. Is this actually going to help you meet your metrics? Is it going to detract? Are there other, as you said, are there other metrics that ought to be looked at? And how does now that you have a map, you can always refer back. Once you have clarity, and again, this is stepped. You don't do all these things all at the same time.
Right.
You start in the biggest, which is organizational goals, and then you're getting a little more granular on the business outcomes and some of the metrics. And then this stakeholder conversation is next. So this can be a fairly big one. and sometimes confusing. And again, the secret stakeholders. Define what a stakeholder is, Miriam. What do you think of when you hear that?
Right. So as we're having some kind of conversation, well, so first of all, you have to understand when we're doing a curriculum mapping in our needs analysis before we even get to this kind of workshop, we have talked with whoever's approached us from the company and said, what stakeholders do you believe should be at the table? And typically it's a group of 4 or 5, everything from a subject matter expert to some kind of leadership, like a manager or somebody that the program is being developed for. You need to have your learning professionals at the table. You may have a C-suite person at the table. You should they should all be aware. And that's, I think, where you get into the hidden stakeholder is we think, oh, I'm developing the safety program for the specific department. Yeah, it's maybe a big program, but then we develop it in isolation instead of inviting initially to the table the CFO.
Right.
What kind of return on investment are they going to get? How can we show that safety incidents go down because we're rolling this out? And you also have to remember this, a curriculum map, again, covers a whole program. So it could be hundreds of modules or experiences within one big program. And so we might even have different stakeholders for different pieces of the map. And this is where we want to identify it. This is where it becomes like a very useful working document. So if I'm on the L&D team 6 months down the road, I'm starting this new topic, I can't even remember that meeting we had, but I can pull it out and say, oh, here's my subject matter expert for this topic. I can send them an email or, whatever it might be, and we can get going. So at this point, this document does become, I think, more of a practical, useful document as we start to fill this in.
So I think of this too. So we've identified all the stakeholders, and you use the expression around the table, but there will definitely be stakeholders that never sit around the table.
That's true. Yep.
They're going to have a say, and in some instances they may have a final say. I'm thinking of a project that we did. We worked with the subject matter experts. We worked with the learning team. We built the asset. There was a stakeholder we never knew about.
Right.
And so we did all the iterative stuff. We gave them stuff. They reacted. They approved. We got to pretty much the end of the project.
It was the end of the project. Yeah.
And a marketing person that we didn't know about came in and said, well, I hate all the colors and I hate all the design. And we had to start completely over because there's this marketing person. No one ever spoke of this person. And we had no idea that this person would have final say over this project. And they came screaming in at the last second. And had they been involved, had they been identified right from the start, identification is part of it. But I think there's, and we've talked about this before, but a communication plan with those people.
Yeah.
So there will be stakeholders where you are in a Zoom meeting or you're sitting around a table. There are going to be a bunch of stakeholders that'll never be at that table and never be in a Zoom meeting. You need to know who those people are, and you need to have a plan for how often you're going to communicate to them.
And what do they need to see? Like what stages do they need to see and sign off on?
Yep. So what are the milestones? Do you need to update them weekly? Do you need to update them every 2 weeks or monthly? It's great to have a plan at this point because you can save yourself. It's no different than software development. I know some of the folks on this webinar are more into software, but if you're not speaking to the people or communicating to the people with the final thumbs up, thumbs down power, you're going to find yourself in trouble at some point.
And we've also found too, that if we do it right and we identify and we ask for everyone and we make a map, if you're dealing with a reasonable stakeholder higher up, sometimes they say, I want this or this, and we can point back and say, well, look, here are your organizational goals. Here are the business outcomes. This is why we decided to do it this way. They will often then say, oh, you're totally right. Like I didn't understand the context. This completely makes sense. And they can see that you have a plan. It wasn't just a random. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you just have to scrap it all and start over, like we said. But there's a cost to that.
The big cost.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, next, let's talk organizational values. And again, just a differentiator, right?
Yes.
Organizational goals, business outcomes. You've identified all the stakes. Haven't you covered the organizational values and the business outcomes and the organizational goals. And the truth is, you really haven't yet.
Right.
Because the organizational values, the organizational goals are often the what, right? The business outcomes are how you're going to measure.
Yep.
And suddenly there's this value question, and that's more of Simon Sinek. For those of you who are fans of Simon Sinek, he talks about the why, the why question. And that's a completely different discussion than business outcomes and even organizational goals. So talk us through organizational values a little bit.
Yeah, and I will mention that each of these topics here, some go faster than others, right? So organizational values, now remember, we're a vendor working with a company, and our listeners are inside, a company working with different departments and things like that. But we will often just go to the company website, we'll go to any other documentation we can find and try to fill this in already. But the questions we ask are, how important are their values to them? Because if we do our job right, the learning needs to reflect the company values. It can actually reinforce company values. It can also uncover the fact that, we have these values. They're a piece of paper stuck in the break room. Nobody even knows they're not operationalized in any way. So that's why we ask those questions.
I remember when Enron went down, there was a wonderful picture of their mission statement about being people of integrity and truth tellers, written large in their lobby, and apparently no one saw it when they walked into work.
Well, and that's, I think, to me, it's actually one of the most interesting and biggest values that a learning team can bring. We can help reinforce those values. We can help operationalize them, because when a learner comes to, it's all about the engagement piece and motivation. When I come to a digital learning experience, I want to know what's in it for me. Why am I doing this? Why am I taking my time? I'm making a choice right now to participate. And so if that learning experience demonstrates to me that here's why, because we believe in this at our company and we want to bring you into that and we want you to care. And for example, safety. Okay, well, obviously we don't want people to get hurt, but if we can weave through that, we care about the people that work here. We want you to be safe. We want you to go home to your family at night, all of that. I've increased the motivation level too of the people going through my learning experience. But if we never ask those questions, we just cranked out another, don't fall off the high-low type.
Don't touch this.
Don't touch that. We haven't really added any value to the organization.
Would you say that every learning experience of almost any kind either contributes to or detracts from the hoped for values of the organization? Because it's communication internal, and even how well things are done.
Absolutely.
Even the quality. If you put and some of you who do L&D know, if you put people through a lousy, bad, terrible, boring, hour and a half long, click, click, click kind of session, you have inherently communicated something to them about how much you value their time. Yeah,
absolutely. It's really important. And again, we don't always have the budgets to do maybe something through the roof, but the fact that it's done cleanly, the fact that it has done well, has good stories, that communicates we care about these people in our company and we're going to give them our best effort.
I remember one very, very large retailer who was dealing with an enormous amount of turnover. She came in as the chief learning officer, or whatever her title was, but that was a role. She was the head of learning. And she said, put me through orientation for what, a low-level, low-paid person would do. And she said, after 3 hours of that, I would have left immediately. That communicated. She said, we have to start completely over, because this communicated, you don't care about me. You've not even bothered to think through what it might be like to sit through this awful experience. And she said, I had that conversation. I think maybe you and I had that conversation with her. And she said that this is terrible. We can't do that. So it's not only what's being said, but how it's being said. And every opportunity that you communicate is an opportunity to reinforce or gut your values. So you make choices every time you do that. All right, this is a little harder one for people sometimes to get their heads around. And what we were just talking about kind of transitions into learning culture. What is a learning culture, Miriam?
Well, every organization has one, whether you think you do or not. So if you think you don't have one, most likely it's not a great one. And so organizational values, the reason they're in this order is that organizational values flow very quickly into learning culture. You really just articulated learning culture. And so we ask a lot of times to the stakeholders around the table, how is learning, how are, training, how is that viewed in your company? What's currently being done? Is it seen as, oh, this is an opportunity for me to develop and grow because my company cares? Or is it seen as punishment? I have to take this. I already have 100 other things to do. There's no time devoted to it. Those are critical questions, because when you start developing materials, if learning is seen as punishment, you have an extra hurdle to overcome in terms of motivation. And especially when you're designing a large program, it might be your opportunity for a fresh start.
Change it. Yep.
Change the culture. And so those are really good questions. Another one is like, what are the barriers? What's worked really well? Even down to some design questions, like, do the people in your company love competition? Right. Are we going to make this into a game, or do they view that as something that's sort of silly and they prefer to do? Right. So is tech a piece of your culture? That's actually a huge question, because if the people taking this, your learners, don't have access to a laptop or an iPad or anything, and they have to go find it, that is a huge barrier. And I need to be careful how I design it, as opposed to, oh, everybody's pretty tech savvy. They have multiple devices. They can access this on. It's very easy. So
but that's also a challenge too, because if you're dealing with an audience, and we're sort of getting into the next one, right? But if you're dealing with a high tech audience that plays a lot of games and has do a lot of things that release dopamine into the brain, right? And you put them in a very boring click, click, click e-learning, you're not doing yourselves any favors. I really like your statement that every company has a learning culture, whether you realize it or not.
Right.
It would be wise to have some conversations with some people in that learning culture who would give you their unbiased, unvarnished
outside
opinion.
The table. Somebody
outside the table.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And actually ask them, how is this working for you? Which kind of leads us into the next one, learners. So talk to us about why it's important for us to know about our learners.
Right. And so for anybody that's on an L&D team or has that background, this of course seems very obvious. But the thing I guess I would say I caution them against is making these assumptions. I've been on this team for 20 years. Right. I know the people at this company. I know what they like. And I'm just going to run through a string of questions that you can ask. One of the things we like to do is ask, what's the day-to-day like for this person? That gives us a really good insight into when and how they might be able to access their digital learning experience. Why should they care about this topic? Because if it's truly something that's kind of on the periphery, we have to work extra hard when we design it to make it motivating. If it's a leadership program and they participate and do well, they're going to move up in the company. Well, now we have something a little different. We have this intrinsic motivation.
Right.
We ask things like, what deflates your learners? How will this make an immediate impact? And another question I thought was so important is, how are people in your company handling working from home? I think different companies have different, again, cultures, and maybe their people are loving it. Maybe their people are really struggling. Right. Those are questions to ask that help us kind of get at, maybe unearth questions or content and things about our learners we hadn't really thought about in the past.
And then we have to deal with some very simple things like language barriers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You mentioned before about access to technology. So if this is digital learning, do the people who are doing it actually have the technology to do it? Do they have the hardware and the connectivity?
Yep.
That feels very isolating. If there's a bunch of people who are doing things and you're not able to participate, you feel like you've been set aside. So go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was just going to add, a lot of our global learners have access to a cell phone more than anything else.
Right.
And so, but are we really designing our content to be mobile first? Probably not, or at least I would say that's our experience here in the US.
Yeah. and education levels, reading levels. We have all sorts of things to think through there. The last one, and then we'll get into some of the case studies, but the last one you mentioned earlier is topics and objectives. This is where we're sort of sliding into actually building things.
Right. And this is where we are, again, our team does a lot of pre-work. We will, and I should emphasize that if you're on a learning and development team and you're trying to host a curriculum mapping workshop, you need to ask for as much content as possible ahead of time. Like, what are the current topics for Ashcom in particular? What are those programs? Like, what does that leadership program look like at both companies? And you can already start to do some kind of cross-checking of where we have redundancy or gaps. But having everyone at the table, then you can start to make a list of those topics.
Right.
That you have that discussion. Is this really important now that we know what we know about our business outcomes for this year, or perhaps our organizational values? What ones aren't important? What ones are? Where's the redundancy? And this is where we literally start to fill in a spreadsheet. And I would also recommend for our listeners, a spreadsheet is fantastic for the L&D team because now you have your map. But if you're going to report out to your CFO, or maybe your CLO has to show this to the CEO, we often put together a summary kind of PowerPoint, like real high level, because they don't care about cell E55, and what's in that. But this is where we do get into the nitty gritty. What do your learners need to be able to know, do, or believe? What are those topics? I would say we don't often really ever get to the objectives. Those end up happening in the next session once we have agreement on the rest.
But that, so we Mindspring, we developed a number of years ago, sort of a quick way to think through objectives again, and we build it around know, do, and believe. So that's what's listed on your screen here. What do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do? And what do they need to believe? Believe is sort of a strange word, but it means like, they believe this is important. They believe this is integral to the success of themselves and the company.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So just a quick, just a reminder before we dive into a couple of case studies. The first is that, again, the value of curriculum mapping is really gaining alignment. It's establishing a baseline for measurement of return on learning or return on investment. We talk a lot about, we have a number of assets that we've built, software that we've built, and ebooks on what it takes to actually judge the return on investment. We call it the learning scorecard. It helps determine where the redundancies are or the gaps are, and it creates priorities. The gaps and redundancies thing, we are working with a very, very large global company right now that has an enormous amount of learning experiences, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them.
Huge,
and there's a ridiculous amount of redundancy, and so they're sort of asking us to boil this down, to shorten it, and make it, not even the modality for how it's delivered, but just get it into shorter pieces and get rid of all the repeats. And there's some gaps in it.
It's a huge job. It's a, and again, that's why we talk about doing it in 2-hour time chunks, because there's just so much work and thought that goes into it, getting consensus with everyone around the table.
Well, let's talk through some examples. So
we have 3.
This is a medical device company, and give us some details on that. This is an interesting story.
It really is, because the audience was twofold. So first of all, the company is making this medical device, but it's being shipped to actual patients in their home. And
they are the end user.
They are the end user using the device. And what we designed it to be was, I hate to use the word pre-work because that's not really it, but there were some learning exercises we wanted them to go through before they even got their device. And then eventually they take that device and they do attend like an in-person with a clinician, with a nurse. But so there are some really interesting stakeholders at the table. We obviously have our medical professionals and our device manufacturer, but we have a 15-year-old teenager who's going to be using it at home, and a 75-year-old gentleman. And So it was very interesting to hear what would work
Plus
for them.
federal regulators are
all kinds of
right. There's all sorts of legal
yes.
things that have
yes.
to happen in the training to make sure that the training provides everybody with what they need to know, because non-medical people are using a medical device.
Correct.
And the risks are relatively high. So
right.
you have to make sure that everybody, so how did, and we built it using existing materials. Talk to us about the learner journey.
Yeah, so we took a little different approach with this. So once we finished the curriculum map and we had the topics all identified, that's great. But again, we're talking about anyone from someone who's 15 or even a child whose parent is trying to help them all the way up through an adult. So what we felt would be most useful is let's create a map of what is the learner from the moment they receive it in the mail or prior to them receiving it in the mail. What do they need to know? So when they get it in the mail in this box, they don't open it and accidentally throw away something, or like they know what they're looking
familiarity.
at. Yep, there's familiarity, there's some comfort level. So we actually created sort of these milestones of what they need to know at different steps along the way, all the way. And it was a blended approach, like we said. I mean, we don't want our listeners to think this is only digital. They attended in-person sessions at their local, whether it was a clinic or hospital with clinicians, but to begin with, we wanted them to have some familiarity with this device, because at the end of the day, it's supposed to make their life easier.
So for this one, we went through the organizational goals, the business outcomes. We talked about the stakeholders, for which there were many. That was complex. The organizational values, obviously, this is a medical device manufacturer, and human thriving and human well-being and human health is enormously important. The learning culture is spread all over, because, as you said,
it could be anyone.
You might have a child and you might have somebody in their 80s, and who knows what their reading level is.
Or their familiarity and comfort with technology.
Yep. Absolutely. So we had to work on learning culture and learning and figuring out who the learners are, and then working through the topics and objectives for doing that. Our next example of this was an electrical and safety distributor. This was a worldwide organization, and they were looking at their original leadership program. So talk us through this a little bit.
And this is actually very similar to the Ashcom example. So there wasn't a merger, but it was one large company who had divisions all around the world. And each of those divisions are kind of doing their own thing. And in terms of leadership, which made it unique too. This wasn't safety as you would imagine, right? But it's not, it's leadership. Well, that's really critical that we have alignment across all of those divisions. So you can see immediately doing a curriculum map where we're identifying what are the organizational goals and what are the company values. If we don't know those, how are we going to help them define leadership for that company? So we had stakeholders from all over the world at the table, and we had to work really hard. Every topic that we wanted to put in, we had to track back. Does this really fit our values? Is this crucial to what we're trying to convey?
Were there some arguments?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And again, when I say argument, I mean, it's just consensus. You're trying to build consensus. You have to hash through those things. And at the end of the day, you'll never create anything that will be bought into unless you get that upfront agreement.
Yeah. Got to have those conversations.
Yep.
Good. And then the last one, this was a really fun one.
Yes.
This was our team here had a lot of fun, not just doing the curriculum mapping, but actually building a lot of the content. We built content on how to make French fries and all sorts of cool stuff. Very creative. But talk to us. Tell us this story.
Yeah. So this was a really interesting one because this was, we were still really just barely coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
And it was fairly local to us. And this is a national restaurant franchise, but it's privately held. So company values are really important to actually the married couple that owned this company. And there were some brothers involved too. So we wanted to meet in person, but also we have all of the COVID regulations. So we're in this monstrous conference room, like not even really conference. It's at a hotel, right? Everybody's spread out.
And you're using megaphones to talk to each other across the room.
And I will say, honestly, I included this example because it's a bit of a cautionary tale, because we had not done this workshop very many times in person. And we get there, and the first thing we realize is that half of these stakeholders didn't even know that the company owners wanted to move a lot of this onboarding online. Okay. So they didn't even know. So already they're a little riled up. Why are we using our budget for this? What's going on? Why are we here? And we haven't seen each other in person in a year and a half. So the people from Mindspring facilitating it and I say this as a cautionary tale in a good way, like they were so amazing. They just pivoted completely to like, all right, the first thing we have to do here is and that's why we started to include columns like business goals, company values. We had to start there and get alignment. We didn't even talk about topics, right? Because first we had to make sure we're all on the same page that this is even important.
And imagine if you had created a bunch of learning experiences and had not gone through the process of curriculum mapping. There would have been not only no buy-in, there would have been some very angry leadership people, because they would have now they would have had those arguments, but on a much bigger scale after you spent all the time and the money creating the assets. So
it was because of this example early on, it's one of the main reasons we've added some of the columns we talked about, because it just was so apparent we had to roll. And some companies, like you said, they had that nailed down. We moved through that in half an hour, but you just never know. So.
All right. Well, we have saved some time at the end of the session for questions.